The worst mistakes in life rarely begin with an argument. Sometimes they begin with a surprise meant to say, "I love you." That Friday afternoon, I left work 3 hours early with the biggest smile I had worn in weeks. Rachel had been planning a solo fishing trip for nearly a month, and she kept telling me how badly she needed a quiet day by the lake to clear her mind after an exhausting season at work. I believed her completely. She had always loved peaceful mornings on the water, a thermos of coffee beside her tackle box, and the kind of silence that only existed far away from traffic and ringing phones. I thought it would be romantic if I surprised her. I stopped at her favorite deli and picked up a turkey sandwich on fresh sourdough, a bag of kettle chips, and the lemon bars she always ordered whenever we visited that little shop downtown. On the way out, I bought a small bouquet of wildflowers from a roadside stand, because she once told me they felt more genuine than expensive roses. As I drove toward Pine Hollow Lake, I imagined the look on her face when she saw me walking down the dock carrying lunch instead of another work meeting on my calendar. We had been married for 8 years, and lately life had become so busy that simple moments together felt more valuable than expensive vacations. I wanted to remind her that she was still my favorite surprise. The drive took almost 90 minutes, winding through quiet country roads lined with tall pines and open fields. The weather could not have been more perfect. The sky was bright blue with slow-moving white clouds, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves as if the entire afternoon had decided to slow down. By the time I reached the marina, the parking lot was nearly half full. Pickup trucks, family sport utility vehicles, and boat trailers stretched across the gravel lot. I spotted Rachel's silver crossover almost immediately. I smiled without thinking. She was already out on the lake. Then my eyes drifted to the vehicle parked directly beside hers. It was a dark blue pickup truck I had never seen before. At first I thought nothing of it. Fishing lakes attract plenty of strangers every weekend. But something about the way the truck was parked caught my attention. It sat unusually close to Rachel's vehicle, almost as though the two drivers had arrived together. I quietly laughed at myself for even noticing something so insignificant. I grabbed the cooler with our lunch, the flowers, and started toward the dock. Tom Henderson, the owner of the marina, recognized me before I reached the office. He smiled warmly and asked if I was joining my wife for the afternoon. His question surprised me because Rachel had specifically told me she wanted to spend the day fishing alone. Trying to sound casual, I answered that I wanted to surprise her. Tom nodded politely before glancing toward the lake. "Well," he said with an easy smile, "you should not have any trouble finding them." Them. It was only one word, just 4 letters carried away by a gentle breeze. Yet that single word stopped me in my tracks. I looked at Tom, wondering if I had misunderstood him. Before I could ask another question, a family walked into the office asking about boat rentals, and the conversation ended as naturally as it had begun. I stood there for several seconds, staring across the water. The lake shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, peaceful and beautiful, giving away nothing. I rented a small aluminum fishing boat, placed the cooler and flowers carefully inside, started the quiet electric motor, and slowly eased away from the dock. The farther I moved across the lake, the more I searched the water ahead, hoping I would find Rachel exactly where I expected her to be. Instead, a tiny fishing boat came into view near the far shoreline. Even from a distance, I recognized her favorite tan fishing hat. She was not alone. The word "them" stayed in my mind as I guided the small boat across the calm surface of Pine Hollow Lake. I tried to convince myself there was a simple explanation. Maybe Rachel had met another fisherman on the dock. Maybe Tom had misunderstood. Maybe the person sitting in that boat was just someone she had spoken with for a few minutes. I wanted every possible explanation except the one my mind kept returning to. As I moved closer, I noticed Rachel sitting near the front of the boat with her fishing rod resting beside her. Across from her sat a man I had never seen before. He looked to be in his early 40s, wearing a gray jacket and a baseball cap. They were not doing anything unusual. They were simply talking. That almost made it harder. There was no obvious reason for me to feel the way I did, yet something inside me felt unsettled. I slowed the motor and stopped several yards away, far enough that they would not notice me immediately. I told myself I was only trying to understand what was happening, but the truth was, I was afraid of what I might learn. For the first time in 8 years of marriage, I felt like I was looking at a part of my wife's life that I had never seen before. Rachel was someone who valued privacy, but she had never been secretive with me. We shared bills, plans, worries, and dreams. We had built a home together where honesty was supposed to be the foundation. That was why the scene in front of me felt so confusing. The man handed Rachel a folder from a waterproof bag beneath the seat. She opened it carefully and looked through several pages while listening closely. I watched her expression change from curiosity to concern. My first instinct was to create a story in my head. Every small detail became something bigger. The folder, the secret meeting, the unfamiliar truck, the fact that she had not mentioned anyone joining her fishing trip. I hated how quickly my imagination filled in the empty spaces. I remembered all the times Rachel had trusted me when I worked late or traveled for business. She never questioned every detail. She never searched for reasons to doubt me. Yet there I was, sitting alone on a fishing boat, doing exactly that to her. I looked down at the cooler beside me. The sandwich I had carefully chosen was still wrapped. The flowers were beginning to bend slightly from the warm afternoon air. They suddenly felt like reminders of how far away I was from the moment I had imagined. I had arrived hoping to make my wife smile. Instead, I was hiding behind distance, watching her from across the water. Before I could decide what to do, Rachel looked up and turned her head toward my direction. My heart immediately raced. I wondered if she had seen me, but she simply looked back toward the shoreline and continued talking. A few minutes later, the man pointed toward something inside the folder. Rachel leaned closer to examine it. There was no laughter, no romantic gesture, no secret affection, only serious conversation. That detail should have comforted me, but it created even more questions. If nothing improper was happening, why had she never mentioned this person? Why had she chosen to keep this meeting private? I started the motor again and slowly moved my boat closer. I was still not ready to confront her. I needed one more minute. One more piece of information. One more reason to understand what I was seeing before I changed the course of our entire marriage based on a moment I did not fully understand. Then the man picked up his phone, showed Rachel something on the screen, and I saw her expression completely change. She looked worried. Not guilty. Not afraid. Worried. And somehow that was the first clue that made me question whether I had been looking at the wrong story all along. My hand rested on the small electric motor, but I did not move any closer. Something inside me kept whispering that if I rushed this moment, I might spend the rest of my life regretting it. The lake remained perfectly still except for gentle ripples spreading behind the other boat. A pair of ducks drifted across the water as though nothing unusual was happening. Rachel lowered the folder into her lap, while the man pointed toward another document inside a waterproof envelope. They were speaking quietly enough that I could not hear a single word. Every instinct urged me to row straight toward them and demand an explanation. Yet another part of me remembered every promise Rachel and I had made during our marriage. We had promised to trust each other even when life became complicated. We had promised to ask questions before making accusations. I repeated those promises silently, hoping they would quiet the growing storm inside my head. I picked up the binoculars I kept in my boat for spotting birds along the shoreline. Looking through them, I realized something that immediately challenged the story I had been building in my mind. The man was not dressed for a relaxing fishing trip. His fishing rod had remained untouched since I arrived. Instead, his attention stayed fixed on paperwork. He occasionally wrote notes on a legal pad balanced against a small clipboard. Rachel nodded several times while studying the documents with remarkable concentration. Whatever this meeting was about, fishing clearly was not the reason they were there. I lowered the binoculars and looked at the bouquet of wildflowers lying beside the cooler. A few petals had begun to curl in the afternoon heat. They suddenly felt like symbols of my expectations rather than reality. I had driven all this way believing I understood exactly how the day would unfold. Instead, every passing minute reminded me how dangerous assumptions could become when they were allowed to grow without evidence. I thought back over the previous several weeks. Rachel had been unusually distracted at home. More than once I had found her quietly reading documents after dinner before quickly closing the folder when I entered the room. I assumed work had become more demanding. She never seemed dishonest. If anything, she seemed worried. I remembered waking up one night to find her sitting alone on the back porch, staring into the darkness with a cup of tea. When I asked whether everything was all right, she smiled gently and told me she was simply trying to clear her thoughts. I accepted that answer because I believed every marriage needed room for private moments. Now those memories returned with entirely different meanings, although I still could not tell whether my new interpretation was any more accurate than the old one. Suddenly the man reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small business card. He handed it to Rachel, who studied it carefully before placing it inside the folder instead of her purse. That tiny detail caught my attention. If this had been a secret personal relationship, why exchange a business card only now? Why spend nearly the entire meeting discussing paperwork first? Rachel glanced toward the shoreline again, her expression thoughtful rather than anxious. Then she folded the documents neatly, secured the waterproof envelope, and carefully placed everything back into the storage compartment beneath the seat. The meeting appeared to be ending. My pulse quickened as I realized I had only seconds left to decide what kind of husband I wanted to be. I could rush toward that boat carrying suspicion, or I could approach carrying the trust Rachel had earned during 8 years of marriage. As I slowly guided my boat forward, the breeze shifted across the lake, carrying faint fragments of their conversation toward me for the very first time. I could not make out every word, but I heard one sentence clearly enough to stop my heart for an entirely different reason than I had expected. Rachel quietly said, "He cannot find out until we have proof." The words echoed across the quiet water long after the breeze carried them away. He cannot find out until we have proof. I sat motionless in my boat, staring at Rachel as though I had never truly known her. My first reaction was not anger. It was confusion. Every possibility raced through my mind at once. Was she talking about me? Was someone else involved? Had I accidentally stepped into the middle of a problem much larger than I understood? For several long seconds I forgot about the flowers beside me, the lunch growing warm inside the cooler, and the surprise I had spent all afternoon planning. Nothing mattered except understanding why my wife believed something needed to stay hidden. I watched as the man closed the folder and carefully placed it back inside the waterproof bag. Rachel nodded once before looking out across the lake. Her expression was thoughtful, almost burdened, as though she had been carrying a responsibility alone for far too long. There was no excitement on her face, no happiness about keeping secrets, only quiet determination. That single detail kept me from making the biggest mistake of my life. If I had allowed suspicion to control me, I would have driven my boat straight toward them demanding answers. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, reminding myself that one sentence without context could mean almost anything. The man spoke again, but this time, the distance swallowed most of his words. I caught only scattered fragments. Documents. Bank records. Verification. None of those words matched the story my fear had tried to create. Rachel reached into her backpack and removed a small envelope. She handed it to the man, who opened it carefully before comparing several papers side by side. He frowned, made a few notes on his legal pad, and then quietly shook his head. Whatever they were discussing seemed complicated, not personal. I realized I had not seen them touch hands, exchange affectionate smiles, or behave like two people sharing a private romance. They looked more like co-workers solving a difficult problem than two people hiding a relationship. That observation should have brought immediate relief, yet another question quickly replaced the first. If this was legitimate, why had Rachel never mentioned it? We had always believed that marriage meant facing problems together. Why was she carrying this one alone? As I wrestled with those thoughts, Rachel stood up carefully, stretching her legs after sitting for so long. She looked toward the distant shoreline where my boat remained partially hidden behind a line of overhanging trees. For a brief moment our eyes almost met, but she simply scanned the lake before sitting down again. I wondered whether she was thinking about me at that exact moment. I wondered whether she felt guilty for keeping something from me, or whether she honestly believed she was protecting me. The difference suddenly felt enormous. A few minutes later the man removed another item from his bag, not a folder this time, but a laminated identification card. Even from the distance I could tell he was intentionally showing it to Rachel before placing it back inside his wallet. Rachel studied the identification closely and nodded with visible reassurance. That small exchange immediately changed everything. People hiding an affair do not usually pause to verify professional identification in the middle of a quiet lake. My heartbeat slowed for the first time since arriving. I looked down at the flowers again and smiled sadly at how close I had come to believing the worst about the person who had spent 8 years proving she deserved better from me. Just then both boats drifted slightly closer together as the breeze shifted. This time I heard the man clearly enough to understand every word. "Mrs. Carter," he said calmly, "once we confirm the final transaction, we can show your husband exactly who has been using his identity." My hands tightened around the edge of my seat, and in a single instant every assumption I had made began to collapse. For a few seconds I forgot how to breathe. The words I had just heard erased every suspicion I had been carrying across the lake and replaced it with something far heavier. My identity. Someone had been using my identity. Rachel had not been meeting another man behind my back. She had been meeting someone who was trying to protect me. I remained completely still, afraid that even the sound of my small electric motor would interrupt the conversation before I understood the truth. The investigator opened another folder and carefully spread several documents across the seat between them. Rachel leaned forward, studying every page with the same concentration I had mistaken for secrecy only minutes earlier. He pointed to a series of highlighted transactions before explaining something too quiet for me to hear. Rachel slowly nodded, then covered her mouth with one hand as though she had just realized how serious the situation had become. I had never seen that expression on her face before. It was not fear for herself. It was fear for someone she loved. I knew that expression because I had seen it every time someone in my family faced a difficult season. Suddenly, dozens of little moments from the previous month made perfect sense. Rachel asking whether I had recently checked my credit report. Rachel reminding me to update passwords on several online accounts. Rachel quietly organizing old tax records at the dining room table after I had gone to bed. At the time, I thought she was simply becoming more organized. Now I realized she had been searching for answers while trying not to frighten me before she understood the whole picture herself. The investigator removed a photograph from the folder and handed it to Rachel. She studied it for several seconds before quietly shaking her head. Then he placed a second photograph beside the first. This time her eyes widened slightly. Even from a distance I could tell she recognized something important. He immediately wrote another note on his legal pad. Whatever clue they had found appeared significant. My curiosity almost overwhelmed my patience. Every instinct urged me to start the motor and ask Rachel what was happening. But another instinct, one that had grown stronger throughout the afternoon, reminded me that trust sometimes means allowing the truth to arrive before demanding explanations. The investigator finally spoke loudly enough for another sentence to reach me across the water. He explained that several fraudulent financial accounts had been opened using my name, my address, and enough personal information to appear legitimate. Someone had been preparing the scheme for months. Rachel quietly asked whether the person responsible knew they were investigating. He answered that they had been extremely careful and wanted to collect one final piece of evidence before notifying local authorities. That explained everything. It explained why she had insisted on taking a fishing trip alone. It explained why they had chosen the middle of a quiet lake instead of a public office where someone might recognize them. It explained why she had looked worried instead of happy. She had never been protecting a secret from me. She had been protecting an investigation for me. I looked down at the bouquet of wildflowers resting inside my boat and felt both relieved and ashamed. Just 1 hour earlier, I had almost allowed doubt to replace 8 years of trust. Rachel had been carrying an enormous burden by herself because she believed it was the safest way to shield me until she knew the facts. She deserved understanding instead of suspicion. As I sat there reflecting on everything I had almost misunderstood, Rachel carefully closed the folder and thanked the investigator for his help. Then she looked across the lake once more, smiling faintly as she whispered something I could barely hear. This time the breeze carried every word directly toward me. I just hope Daniel never feels guilty for any of this. None of it was his fault. In that quiet moment, I realized the person I had doubted had been thinking about protecting my peace the entire time. The investigator checked his watch before carefully placing every document back into the waterproof folder. Rachel thanked him once more, and the two boats slowly drifted apart with the gentle current. I remained hidden behind the trees for another minute, trying to gather my thoughts before doing anything impulsive. My surprise had become something entirely different. I no longer wanted to catch my wife doing something wrong. I wanted to understand why she had carried such a heavy burden without telling me. As the investigator guided his boat toward the opposite side of the lake, Rachel stayed where she was, quietly staring across the water. She did not cast another fishing line. She simply sat there, holding the folder in her lap, looking more exhausted than I had realized. For the first time that afternoon, I understood she had not come to the lake for peace. She had come because it was one of the few places where no one would overhear a confidential conversation. I took a slow breath, started my electric motor, and steered my boat toward her. This time I did not approach with suspicion. I approached with humility. Rachel looked up as she heard the quiet motor behind her. The moment she recognized me, surprise filled her face. Then she noticed the cooler, the flowers, and the awkward smile I was trying to hold together. She blinked twice before softly asking, "Daniel, what are you doing here?" I laughed quietly, embarrassed by how different the afternoon had become from the one I had imagined. I lifted the bouquet slightly and admitted that I had planned to surprise her with lunch because I thought she deserved a peaceful day away from work. She looked at the flowers for a long moment before smiling with genuine warmth. Then her smile slowly faded as she noticed the direction from which my boat had arrived. Her expression changed from happiness to concern. "How long have you been here?" she asked gently. I chose honesty because anything less would have been unfair after everything I had witnessed. I told her I had arrived before the meeting ended and that I had accidentally heard enough to realize she had not been hiding another relationship. Instead, I knew she had been trying to protect me. Rachel lowered her eyes for several seconds before quietly apologizing. She explained that every investigator she had spoken with warned her not to discuss the case until they confirmed the evidence. If the wrong person learned they were investigating, important records could disappear before authorities had a chance to act. She said keeping the secret had been the hardest thing she had ever done because she hated withholding anything from me. I climbed carefully into her boat after securing mine beside it. We sat facing each other while the afternoon breeze carried gentle ripples across the lake. Rachel reached into the waterproof folder and slowly handed me several copies of financial statements. My own name appeared across the top of every page. Credit accounts I had never opened. Loan applications I had never signed. Addresses I had never lived at. My stomach tightened as I turned each page. Rachel quietly explained that she first discovered the problem after receiving an email about a credit inquiry neither of us recognized. Instead of frightening me before she understood what had happened, she contacted a licensed investigator recommended by a close friend who worked in banking. Every meeting since then had focused on gathering enough evidence before reporting everything to local authorities. She reached across the small space between us and gently held my hand. "I wanted to tell you every single day," she whispered, "but I wanted to bring you answers instead of fear." Looking into her eyes, I realized that while I had spent one afternoon doubting her, she had spent several weeks carrying the weight of protecting our future completely alone. I squeezed her hand gently, knowing that the conversation waiting for us after we returned to shore would change both of our lives forever. We returned to the marina just as the afternoon sun began slipping lower across the trees. The drive home felt completely different from the one I had imagined that morning. The cooler still held the untouched sandwiches, and the wildflowers rested carefully on the back seat between us. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence because it no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. Once we arrived home, Rachel placed the folder on our dining room table and spread every document across the polished wood. For the next 2 hours, we examined each page together. The investigator had organized everything with remarkable precision. There were copies of fraudulent loan applications, credit card accounts opened in my name, mailing addresses that belonged to vacant rental properties, and a timeline showing when each suspicious transaction had occurred. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Whoever had stolen my identity had spent months building a false financial history before attempting larger transactions. Rachel quietly explained that the investigator believed they were very close to identifying the person responsible, but one final financial transfer needed to be verified before local authorities could move forward. Hearing those words made me realize how carefully she had protected every step of the investigation. She had never hidden the truth because she doubted me. She had hidden it because revealing it too early could have ruined everything. I leaned back in my chair and apologized. I admitted that when I first saw her on the lake with another man, fear had almost convinced me to believe the worst. Rachel reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. She smiled softly and told me that fear often writes stories before facts have a chance to speak. She confessed that she had worried about exactly that possibility every day since the investigation began. That was why she had chosen quiet places for every meeting and avoided discussing unusual phone calls at home. She wanted to protect both the investigation and my peace of mind until she could offer real answers instead of frightening possibilities. The following morning, the investigator called with an update. He explained that the final banking records had arrived overnight and confirmed the evidence they needed. He asked whether Rachel and I could meet him together at the local police department later that afternoon. This time there would be no more secrets between us. We drove there side by side, carrying the folder that had nearly become the source of a terrible misunderstanding. Officer Melissa Grant welcomed us into a private office where the investigator carefully reviewed every document once more. He explained that the fraudulent accounts were connected through a series of fake addresses and electronic transfers that all pointed toward the same individual. Because enough verified evidence had finally been collected, the case would now move forward through the proper legal process. Officer Grant thanked Rachel for remaining patient and following professional advice instead of confronting anyone prematurely. She also told me that reporting the situation quickly after confirmation had greatly improved the chances of limiting further financial damage. As we left the station, I felt lighter than I had in weeks, not because every problem had disappeared, but because Rachel and I were finally carrying the burden together. We stopped at a small coffee shop on the way home, ordered 2 hot coffees, and shared one of the lemon bars that had survived untouched inside the cooler since the day before. Rachel laughed when she realized I had brought her favorite dessert all the way to the lake. I finally handed her the slightly faded bouquet of wildflowers that had traveled with me through every unexpected turn of the day. She smiled, placed the flowers gently on the table beside us, and whispered that they were still perfect because they reminded her that even when fear almost pulled us apart, we had found our way back to trust before it was too late. Sitting across from the woman I loved, I understood that the strongest marriages are not built by never facing uncertainty. They are built by choosing each other again after uncertainty has tested everything. Over the following weeks, our lives slowly returned to a rhythm that finally felt honest again. The investigator stayed in regular contact, updating us whenever another piece of the case moved forward. Every phone call brought a little more clarity and a little less uncertainty. Rachel no longer carried the responsibility alone because every meeting, every document, and every decision became something we handled together. Looking back, I realized that the greatest change had not happened inside a police office or an investigator's report. It had happened at our own kitchen table, where we had chosen complete honesty over quiet assumptions. One evening, while organizing old family files into new folders, I found myself laughing at how many passwords, account statements, and identification documents had accumulated across the dining room. Rachel smiled and teased that we had become far more organized than we had ever planned. Beneath the humor, however, we both understood why those small habits now mattered. We were no longer protecting only financial records. We were protecting the trust that had carried us through one of the most confusing moments of our marriage. A few days later, the investigator invited us to his office to review the final summary before the case officially moved into the next legal stage. He explained that the evidence clearly connected multiple fraudulent accounts to the same individual and that every important document had now been verified. He thanked Rachel for remaining patient throughout the investigation and told me that her careful decisions had likely prevented additional damage to my financial history. Hearing someone else recognize what she had quietly carried filled me with enormous gratitude. On the drive home, I apologized again for allowing doubt to grow so quickly inside my own mind that afternoon at the lake. Rachel reached across the center console and rested her hand over mine. She told me that forgiveness had never been the difficult part. The difficult part had been hoping that when the truth finally arrived, we would still be standing together. I promised her that if life ever placed us in another confusing situation, I would begin with questions instead of conclusions. She smiled and replied that she would begin with openness whenever circumstances allowed, because protecting someone should never become a burden carried alone. That conversation stayed with me long after. We arrived home. The following weekend, we returned to Pine Hollow Lake together. This time, there were no hidden folders, no confidential meetings, and no unanswered questions waiting beyond the shoreline. We launched one small fishing boat just after sunrise and drifted peacefully across the calm water. The same breeze moved gently across the lake, but everything felt different because nothing remained unspoken between us. Rachel laughed when I unpacked the same cooler that still contained fresh turkey sandwiches, kettle chips, and another box of lemon bars from the same neighborhood deli. I also brought a new bouquet of wildflowers, carefully placing them beside her tackle box before handing them to her. She held them close for a moment before quietly thanking me, not for the flowers themselves, but for refusing to let one frightening afternoon define our marriage. We spent several hours fishing without worrying whether we caught anything at all. The conversation flowed easily from future vacation plans to family traditions we hoped to build in the years ahead. As the afternoon sun reflected across the water, I realized the lake no longer reminded me of fear or misunderstanding. Instead, it reminded me that truth often arrives quietly, asking only for enough patience to reveal itself. When we guided the boat back toward the marina, Rachel looked at me with the same warm smile I had hoped to see on the day I first planned my surprise. This time there were no unanswered questions between us, only the quiet confidence that whatever challenges waited ahead, we would never face them from opposite sides of the water again. Almost 1 year passed before I fully understood what that afternoon at Pine Hollow Lake had given us. The legal process eventually reached its conclusion, and the investigator called one final time to let us know the remaining issues had been resolved. Every fraudulent account connected to my identity had been documented, corrected through the proper channels, and removed from my financial record. Officer Melissa Grant thanked us for our patience throughout the investigation and reminded us that careful documentation and timely reporting had made an enormous difference. When I ended that phone call, I felt relief, but it was not because the paperwork was finally finished. It was because Rachel no longer had to carry the weight of protecting me by herself. We had reached the other side together. A few weeks later, I asked Rachel whether she wanted to return to the lake one more time before autumn arrived. She smiled immediately because she already knew exactly why I was asking. We packed another cooler with turkey sandwiches, kettle chips, fresh fruit, and 2 lemon bars from the same little deli that had unknowingly become part of our story. I also stopped at the same roadside flower stand where I had bought wildflowers the year before. The woman working there recognized me and asked whether the flowers had been appreciated. I smiled and answered honestly that they had become part of a memory I would never forget. When we reached the marina, Tom Henderson greeted us with the same friendly smile he always wore. He joked that this time he hoped there would be no surprises waiting out on the water. Rachel looked at me, laughed softly, and squeezed my hand before we walked toward the dock together. We spent the morning drifting across the quiet lake without worrying about catching fish or checking our phones. The water reflected the clear blue sky, just as it had the year before, but this time every familiar place carried a different meaning. We passed the small cove where I had first seen Rachel talking with the investigator. I slowed the boat for a moment, and we both looked toward the shoreline without saying anything. Finally, I admitted that I still thought about how close I had come to allowing fear to replace trust. Rachel answered that she sometimes thought about it too, but not because she remembered my doubt. She remembered how we chose to face the truth together instead of letting misunderstanding become permanent. Those words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Before heading back to shore, I reached beneath my seat and pulled out a small wooden box. Rachel looked at me with surprised eyes as I opened it. Inside was the simple silver wedding band she had placed on my finger 8 years earlier after having it professionally polished and engraved on the inside with 6 new words: always questions before fear. Always us. She smiled through quiet tears as I slipped the ring back onto my finger. Then I handed her another small box containing a matching ring engraved with the same promise. There was no proposal because we had never stopped choosing each other. There was only a renewed promise to protect our marriage with honesty, patience, and trust no matter what unexpected chapter life placed before us. As we guided the boat back toward the marina, I looked across the peaceful water and realized that the surprise I had planned that first afternoon had never happened the way I imagined. Instead of sharing lunch beside the lake, we had uncovered a truth that could have divided us if we had allowed assumptions to speak louder than love. Looking back now, I no longer remember the untouched sandwiches or the flowers that wilted inside the cooler. I remember the decision we made after the confusion ended. We chose to believe that the strongest marriages are not measured by the absence of difficult moments, but by the courage to walk through those moments together. That quiet lake gave me a lesson I will carry for the rest of my life. Trust is never built by knowing every answer. Trust is built by believing in the heart of the person beside you until the truth has the chance to arrive.